I'll begin with my favorite story. The story is that a Jew once entered a pub in Belfast, and a hand landed on his shoulder, and a voice from behind him said, "Catholic or Protestant?" And he said, "For once, I'm lucky. I'm a Jew." And the voice behind him says, "Aye, but are you a Catholic Jew or a Protestant Jew?" So in Israel, when I say that I wrote a history of the settlements and another of Israeli democracy, I'm obviously asked, are you on the left or on the right? And I say, I'm an objective historian. And then I'm asked, yes, but are you objectively for the left or objectively for the right? So I have indeed sought to write old-fashioned history based on the original documents. Nothing is more fun for me than the days in which the documents make me throw out my outline and rebuild my picture of what happened in the past. And I also believe that the history has implications for today, and that's part of what, besides simply a love of writing stories about people, that's part of what drives me to write history. And I'll talk today both about the history and the implications. A moment of Peter mentioned this, a bit of personal background beyond the resume, where I've written. I actually moved to Israel 35 years ago, planning to study for a year, and stayed ever since. I stayed because it's a place where the Jewish issues are the public issues, where the Jewish values, or at least the argument about Jewish values, is the majority argument, and where there is a personal involvement of everyday citizens in public affairs, which is beyond what is imaginable in America. And I have 3 kids, 2 of whom would be called college age if they were living in America. They are busy with other things, which impose a much greater responsibility than going to college would. So I want to, first of all, talk about the idea briefly, because this is the value, to go back to what Tal was talking about, these are the values around which I'm framing what I'm saying today, is that Israel is discussed internally. The most common phrase used to define Israel in internal Israeli discussion is a democratic and Jewish state, or a Jewish and democratic state, and of course nobody agrees what that means. And in particular, there's a question of, are those two terms in tension, or do they complement each other? So for instance, on the intention side of it, Chaim Gans, a philosopher, teaches at Tel Aviv University Law School, explains that nationalism, self-determination, building a country on the basis of a shared national identity, can be understood as a liberal concept. It begins with the right of individuals to live in a place where a basic part of their individual identity, their culture, is preserved and cultivated in the public square, their language, their calendar, their way of looking at the world. But that individual right is, of course, in tension with other rights, such as the rights of minorities. That's normal. In a liberal democratic society, rights come into tension. There is a tension between my right to personal dignity and my right to security, which is expressed every time I go through an American airport. There is a tension between security and freedom of the speech, and so forth. And courts and legislatures spend their time adjudicating the tension between those rights. The opposite approach, now I will stress here, being a good Jew, I believe in both of these opposite approaches. The opposite approach is that Israel must be democratic precisely because it is Jewish, that democracy in a deep sense is not just majority rule, but respect for the minority, for diversity, and that those are deep Jewish values. The Torah says in Vayikra, in Leviticus 19, when a stranger lives with you in your land, do not oppress him. The stranger living with you will be like one of you, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. In Jewish religious tradition, that verse was taken to refer to the convert, and that's important in itself. But it was understood that way because the Jewish polity was restricted for much of Jewish history to the religious community. When we return to our land, to sovereignty, to our own sovereign society, the original meaning of the verse, that we must have respect for the stranger, for the minority, for those who don't agree with us, has to be expressed in the original meaning of the word. So Israel is both democratic and Jewish in tension, and democratic because it is Jewish. Okay, that's the values issue that I'm coming from here. Now, to get to the history. For 15 years, I was the op-ed editor, the opinion editor of the Jerusalem Report, and I once had a columnist who included what could be politely called a factual error in his column. And I said, I can't publish that, it's not true. And he said, but this is an opinion article, and that's my opinion. So I said, okay, I'm going to explain to you how opinion articles work. The facts are the facts, but you can have whatever opinion you want about those facts. So you can say that it's wonderful that the State of Israel was established on May 14th, 1948, or you can say it's terrible, but you can't write in my magazine that the State of Israel was established in 1953. And then I got off the phone with him and I realized that I'd given a really terrible example because I could make an argument for all sorts of other dates for when the State of Israel was established besides May 14th, 1948. So I'd like to talk about that for a moment. It's absolutely true that the state was declared on the afternoon of May 14th, 1948, and that realized the basic goal of political Zionism, that Jews defined as a nation, as an ethnic group, I stress that, as a nation, as an ethnic group, achieved political independence in part of their homeland, a country where they would be the majority, where they would shape the culture, not as the coming of the Messiah, but as a pragmatic achievement in this world. I would stress the issue of national, of ethnic, because I want to make clear that the idea of a Jewish state as understood in Zionism and in Israel, a Jewish state, the parallel term is Czech Republic or French Republic, not Islamic Republic. Okay? The Jews as an ethnic group have achieved national self-determination. It's something that's important to stress, particularly in American context where people usually hear the word Jew as being primarily a religious label, and so Jewish state sounds like a theocracy by definition. It's not. I'll also say, and this here I feel like Tal has given the long introduction to my short comment, is that victory, that creating a state was a victory for a revolutionary movement called Zionism, and I will add here that victory is much more difficult for a revolutionary than defeat. Victory is psychologically the most difficult thing for a revolutionary because that's when you have to go to being what I would call an institutionary, where you go from being the brave guerrillas fighting in the hills or whatever to being bureaucrats, where you have to start respecting the law because you wrote it and it belongs to you. And if you're a national liberation movement, you go from being responsible just for your national group to being responsible for everybody in the country. Israel is, in fact, remarkable among the baby boom countries that became independent after World War II, most of the countries in the world today, because it was established and has continuously remained a democracy. There's no other country established in that period that has that record. But I could argue that the state was really born, as I said, on other dates. So, for instance, I think that there's a good argument that the State of Israel actually became a state between the 21st and the 23rd of June 1948 during what was known as the Alta Lena affair. And what happened there, I'm telling a long and complex historical story on one foot, but the Irgun or Etzel underground, the far-right underground led by Menachem Begin, attempted to bring a ship filled with a very large supply of weaponry to the shores of Israel. Now, just days before that, Begin had signed an agreement to dissolve the Irgun, which had been a separate underground from the mainstream Jewish community and from the mainstream military organization, the Haganah, before independence. He'd signed an agreement to dissolve the Irgun, to integrate its members as battalions into the new Israel Defense Forces, and to stop independent purchases of weapons. And yet, here they were bringing a ship full of arms to Israel in late June. Now, the original idea, the Irgun's original idea, was to actually get those weapons to the shores of Palestine exactly as the British were leaving at the end of the British Mandate on May 14th to 15th, loaded not only with arms, but the original idea was with soldiers, and to conquer all of British Palestine and to establish a Hebrew state, that is to say, a Jewish state, everywhere from the river to the sea, that is to say, to take power and impose policy by force of arms. For all sorts of reasons, they got their act together a little bit late. The ship was arriving 5 to 6 weeks late, and they still wanted, the Irgun demanded to unload the Alta Lena and send the weapons to its units within the army, acting as if those units were still linked to a political movement led by somebody else than the government. And David Ben-Gurion, the founding prime minister, and the cabinet said, no, you can't do that. So the Irgun, in any case, attempted to unload the ship by itself, and it ordered its members to leave their army units to come to the shore at Kfar Vitkin, south of Netanya, to do so. It was functioning as if those units remained in the control of a political faction. Ben-Gurion and the cabinet ordered the IDF to stop them, if necessary, by force of arms. There was a battle on the beach at Kfar Vitkin, and then the next day on the beach in Tel Aviv. If you stay in the Sheraton or the Hilton or one of the other high-rent district hotels and look down at the beach, that's where the Battle of Alta Lena took place. The IDF forces on the shore were commanded by a 26-year-old colonel by the name of Yitzhak Rabin. Finally, after a day of fighting, Ben-Gurion ordered the artillery corps to fire at the ship. A shell hit the ship, its crew abandoned ship, and it was sunk afterwards. And Ben-Gurion explained the need to do all of this in the cabinet. He said, the moment that the army and the state surrender to another armed force, we have nothing else. We have nothing left, sorry. The episode, the affair, established, to use Max Weber's term in his definition of the modern state, that the state would have a monopoly on the legitimate use of force, that there would be one body that could have a military, and that was the state. And in a sense, that's when the state came into being. Politics would not be conducted via rival armed groups. This is not obvious. Greece was still in the midst of a 3-year brutal civil war after its liberation movements succeeded in liberating it from the Germans. Angola underwent civil war between its liberation movements for 15 years after they succeeded in throwing out the Portuguese. In the country to the north of Israel, one of the political parties, Hezbollah, has its own army. When that takes place, you cannot have a democracy, even in the Lebanese example, because in democratic politics, groups negotiate rather than fighting in the streets, and they negotiate on the basis of their electoral strength, not on the basis of their military strength. When parts of the army answer to factions, you can have elections, but you don't have a democracy. So in a very real way, the Alta Lena affair established that Israel was a state and at least had the potential to be a democracy. Another date that I could give, arguing against my own original supposition that there's only one date for the creation of the state of Israel, another date I could give is the winter and spring of 1949, when Israel signed armistice agreements which set what the borders of the state were. Weber's full definition is that the state has a monopoly on the legitimate use of force in a defined territory. You're all used to looking at the map, at the globe, seeing those lines defining where one country stops and another begins. That's basic to our modern idea of what a state is. It's also basic to a democracy, because if you're going to have government by the consent of the governed, you have to know who the governed are, and that's defined territorially. I would note that those borders were de facto from an international point of view at that point, but they were de jure from an internal Israeli point of view. That is to say, Israeli law and sovereignty extended up to those lines. And for all practical purposes, with a couple of small exceptions, that is still the case today. So the territory was defined. As a democracy, Israel was born on January 25th, 1949, when the first elections were held for Knesset. By the way, the first motion of no confidence in the first government was filed about 3 months after that by the same Menachem Begin, now head of a very right-wing party in the Knesset. Begin's reason, the reason he said that the Knesset should vote no confidence and throw out Ben-Gurion's government, was that at the end of the War of Independence, a young general by the name of Yigal Allon had sent a letter to Ben-Gurion saying, I would like permission to conquer the West Bank. I can do it within a few days. The Jordanian army is in a state of collapse. We can take the whole West Bank. And Ben-Gurion said no. And Begin saw not conquering the whole land of Israel as treasonous and said that the Knesset should throw Ben-Gurion out. And Ben-Gurion's response from the Knesset podium was, let's say we can conquer all the land of Israel militarily, which I'm sure we could. Then what? We will make one state, but that state will want to be democratic. There will be general elections, and we, the Jews, will be in the minority. When the question arose of having the entire land without a Jewish state, or a Jewish state without the entire land, we chose a Jewish state without the entire land. That's April 1949. This also explains why it's so difficult to be a pundit in Israel, an opinion writer, because everything important has already been said by somebody wiser and more articulate than you.